Well, welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our breakout session on carbon pricing. It is my honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Danny Richter. Many of you know Danny, but he is a leading expert in climate policy and advocacy. He is the co-director of the Pricing Carbon Initiative and founder of Richter Capitol Hill Strategies. At the Carbon Pricing Initiative, Danny works to bring people together from both sides of the aisle to compare strategies for effective carbon pricing policies. And through his consultancy firm, Richter Capitol Hill Strategies, Danny helps organizations navigate the U.S. legislative process on climate issues and helps researchers drive policy with data. But most importantly, before all this, Danny was our chief of baking. Ask him about his sourdough. But he was also our vice president of government affairs at Citizens Climate Lobby, where he played a key role in building relationships on Capitol Hill and moving carbon pricing legislation forward. Danny's stewardship played a key role in the 2018 introduction of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, with original co-sponsors from both parties in both the House and the Senate. Danny's academic background includes a PhD in oceanography from the University of California, San Diego, but how he learned to bake is still a mystery to this day. With that, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here and sharing with us today, Danny.
Well, thank you, Ricky. I think it's important to keep just a little bit of mystery. It keeps things fresh. So, but not too much mystery around the next Congress. Let's not keep that fresh. Let's figure that out. And specifically, let's try and figure out carbon pricing opportunities in the next Congress. I have three goals for you today. The first goal that I have is that by the end of this presentation, you will agree with me that the opportunity for a carbon price narrowed after the election, but it didn't quite disappear. Hope you'll also leave this presentation with the impression that it is probably limited to a carbon tariff, not reflected by a carbon price. And CCL will position itself to have influence in any carbon border tariff discussion and make clear we prefer a domestic price as well. So how are we going to get to those learning goals? First, I'm going to talk about the election and what we learned. Second, I'm going to break down what some of the consequences of that are for CCL's priorities. Then we'll talk about CCL's path forward. We'll connect that to the opportunity that is before us in this Congress. We'll end with some conclusions, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So what have we learned since the election? Well, we've learned that former President Trump is now President-elect Trump. We've learned that the Senate will have a 53 to 47 Republican majority. And we've learned that the House will have a 220 to 215 Republican majority, which is actually a little bit smaller than it was at the start of this current Congress, the 218th. However, I want to break down the House a little bit more because this is really small. Since 218 votes are required for a majority, Republicans will be able to lose two votes. And there are two ways of losing a vote. Generally, what people mean most of the time when they say lose a vote, they mean that not only are they not voting for it, they're voting against it. So it goes the other way. But Republicans could also just vote present, and that's kind of like half a vote. So there are two ways of doing this. But when I say lose two votes, that means they vote the other way. On top of that, we have three Republicans who were reelected to the House, who were appointed to various positions by President Trump, which means that there would need to be a special election to fill their seat. One of those Republicans has just simply resigned. And if those nominations go quickly, we could have a 217 to 215 Republican majority until those special elections are held. That could be months. It could be 3 or 4 months. So what does that mean? If there is a 217 to 215 majority, that means Republicans can lose 0 votes. Because if they lose 1 vote, if that one Republican votes the other way, then it is 216 to 216. That's a tie. It doesn't pass. So this is going to be an incredibly difficult, just mechanically, an incredibly difficult majority for Republicans in the House in particular to work with. In the Senate, they're 7 votes shy of being able to break a filibuster. So we are looking at reconciliation. We should have that on our radar. As I mentioned, in the House, this is a smaller majority than the Republicans currently enjoy in the House. Another thing about this Congress is Republicans have had to rely on Democrats quite a bit to pass major legislation. And it will be very interesting to see if that dynamic continues with Trump back in the White House. My guess is that some element of that will continue. Again, especially for these next few months, it's only going to take one Republican to not vote with the party, and then something doesn't pass the House. So that is a really strong constraint. Another thing that we really shouldn't pass over is that high prices were a dominant theme for election. And this is a problem both for carbon pricing and for tariffs. I want to, again, focus on this a little bit more. Residual high prices from pandemic era inflation have been widely cited in post-election polls and analysis as perhaps the dominant factor swinging votes to Trump. And this was also a global trend in 2024. So what you're looking at here, this is a chart from the Financial Times, and this shows the vote share of the governing parties in national elections and whether they won re-election or they didn't. What you see there in 2024, and the red dot is the United States this year. This is the first year since 1950 when no governing coalition has won re-election. So the pandemic caused price rises around the world, and it's not just Americans who are angry about that. They're angry about that all over the world, and parties who happen to be in power when that happened, they're getting punished by voters around the world. So what does this mean for the opportunity in the next Congress? Well, if you tuned in for my October 17th CCU, I highlighted 3 external factors that might drive the conversation towards consideration for a domestic carbon price. Those 3 factors were the expiration of the 2017 Trump tax cuts, also known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the ballooning deficit, and the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or the EU CBAM. So how did the election change how we're viewing these 3 external factors? Well, a domestic carbon price is almost certainly out, since high prices were such a clear lesson from the election, and that's just not where President Trump's head is at. So he would probably veto something like that. Divided government of some kind was probably always a necessary ingredient for a domestic price. So this is a bummer. We also have President Trump, as I mentioned, who has referred to himself as a tariff man. He loves tariffs, even though they cause inflation. So there's a little bit of a political paradox there. But he's moving forward with this. He's already declared that he's going to place a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada and a 10% tariff on China just across the board. Those are our 3 largest trading partners. So it'll be really interesting to see how this all develops. It is unclear if he'll be open to a carbon intensity-based tariff, which is really quite a different thing. A country can get out, if you base a tariff on carbon intensity, a country can get out of paying it by improving their industrial processes for their exported goods. You can't do that with the kinds of tariffs that President Trump is talking about here. And it's also very salient that in 2022, Republicans were pitching Democrats on this. For those of you who remember back to May of 2022, Senator Joe Manchin was leading bipartisan efforts to help come to an agreement to get some version of Build Back Better, as it was still called at that point, over the line. And a news article from that would Build Back Better would become the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. And a news article had this quote: Republicans appear optimistic about pitching their vision for a carbon border adjustment fee. So even 2 years ago, more than one Republican was pitching Democrats on some sort of carbon border adjustment fee. One of the Republicans in that group was Senator Bill Cassidy, and of course, he's come up with the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. It is a carbon-based tariff that is not reflected by a domestic carbon price. And so we know what at least one of those Republicans was thinking. And of course, Senator Lindsey Graham is also on that. So 2 Republicans. Some other factors that I highlighted. It's clear that extending the Trump tax cuts of 2017 is a top priority for Republicans. However, it is unclear if the debt or the deficit will be at all salient in the coming debate. Early indications are that it won't be, but we will see how things develop. It is also unclear if the EU CBAM will be salient, but I'll talk about some factors that might make it salient. So let's get into that. What has CCL decided to do? Well, we are certainly going to be opportunistic on a domestic carbon price. At present, it seems extremely unlikely that a domestic carbon price is possible. As I said, this really required divided government. However, if the debt becomes salient or the EU CBAM becomes salient, there may be opportunities, and we will be watching very closely for those opportunities. We will be monitoring these situations and ready to spring into actions if they arise. However, we will not be actively advocating for a domestic carbon price. What we will be doing is working strategically to create the opportunity for a passage of a carbon price in the future. Now let's talk about those opportunities. What's going on with the debt? What's going on with the EU CBAM, and what might have to happen in order for a domestic carbon price to become salient? Well, in October, the debt I reported was $35.6 trillion. It is now over 36 trillion. The deficit, which is the gap between what we spend and what we take in revenues as a country in a year, was at 1.9 trillion. The interest alone in the last fiscal year was over $1 trillion. That made it the largest single line item, except for Social Security, in the entire budget. So larger than defense, larger than Medicare. It was just the interest. So that's money going out the door that doesn't provide any services to anybody. However, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, I like to think of them as the group of wonks and nerds that Congress keeps in the basement. Uh, they provided a list of revenue raisers, and in a table on there, they include a tax on emissions of greenhouse gases as one of 17 options for reducing the deficit. And big, big numbers. So these are only policies that could raise a lot of revenue. This is if Republicans decide that they want to pay for the tax cuts, probably we're talking about reconciliation, they may consult that list. And what they modeled, and I'll show you the table in a second, was a $25 per ton carbon price going up at 5% per year. So that's what the CBO modeled. And here's the table, and you can see it down at the bottom. Impose a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, and the CBO estimates that over a 10-year period, that could generate 571 to 865 billion dollars. For reference, it is estimated that the Trump tax cuts, the extension of the Trump tax cuts, would cost $4.5 trillion. So a carbon price at this level would not cover it and might take out almost a quarter of it, but there would need to be more work. So this is what we're talking about if the debt and the deficit becomes salient. Now, if the EU CBAM becomes salient, I think in order for this to happen, businesses would really need to make a big stink. They would need to be talking to Congress that they would like to see a domestic carbon price in the United States. It's easier for them. And this would be businesses who, of course, are trading in the EU. Going against this, because of the EU CBAM, it's actually likely that United States goods are going to increase their market share in the EU market because the United States, on average, is a little bit cleaner than the global average. The proliferation of such policies, other countries who have carbon prices who adopt a CBAM as well, that could change the political calculus. I do think that President Trump, and part of a consequence of a tariff central policy, is the Americans are thinking a lot about what the rest of the world is doing and how the United States relates to other countries. And so if you have a proliferation of CBAMs, that could be the pathways for getting that into the American consciousness could be moving faster in this presidency. And it is also saying that the United States is alone on a carbon price. There is no other developed economy that doesn't have a carbon price. Every single other developed economy has a carbon price. This is something I published a blog on recently for the Pricing Carbon Initiative. You can check it out on our website if you're so inclined. Another thing that is interesting as we're thinking about other countries and things like a CBAM, countries may be less inclined to accommodate a president like President Trump, who has threatened to pull out of NATO. There's a large overlap between countries that have a carbon price and countries that are going into a CBAM and countries that belong to NATO.
Hmm.
And it might be that they see the CBAM as a way to create leverage with President Trump for staying in NATO. And so it might be that they are more willing to tighten the screws on the United States with policies like a CBAM. And so we're going to have to see how this develops. It's gonna be interesting. So, what does it mean to pursue a border carbon tariff for CCL? Well, CCL will engage fully on a border tariff this coming Congress, and the goals would be the same as they have always been. The policy should take a big chunk out of climate pollution. It should take care of low-income households, and it should have political staying power. I think that CCL should also make it clear that we prefer a domestic carbon price as well, but this is not a red line. And the reason for not making a red line is that this keeps us open to opportunities to engage, to move the discussion towards a bigger chunk out of climate pollution, better care of low-income households, more political staying power. If congressional offices believe that a domestic carbon price is a red line for CCL, there are just fewer conversations we're going to be invited to. And this isn't always so bad because climate remains a global problem. So a border carbon tariff can still do quite a bit. You can see in this graph where emissions are coming from. You see the United States there relative to China, the rest of the world, India and Europe. These are where the emissions are coming from. Most of them are from other countries. So a successful trade-focused policy could still accomplish a lot in terms of emissions reductions, especially if that trade-focused policy is tied to the United States economy, which is $10 trillion larger than the EU bloc, the whole EU, and it is $11 trillion larger than China's economy. So this is still an economy that other countries are going to want to have a piece of. Many of you have seen this. I showed this in my October 17th presentation where Catherine Wolfram, who was a co-author on the paper where this figure appeared, she was a co-author. This paper indicates that the EU CBAM is creating incentives for other countries to have their own price because they get to keep the revenue. And what this graph is showing is it's showing a timeline of the number of countries who are having a domestic carbon price under development, under consideration, in discussion, or implemented after the initial announcement of the EU of their CBAM. So it would appear that the EU CBAM, at least, incentivizes other countries to consider domestic carbon prices. Now, I do want to be clear. We are suggesting for CCL that a carbon tariff could do the same thing. However, this is not what the authors said. The authors did not say that a border tariff could do this. They said that an EU CBAM tied to a domestic carbon price could do that. So there is some extrapolation there, and I don't want to have Dr. Wolfram or any of the co-authors go after anybody here. So I do want to make that point. That is, they're not saying a tariff, they're saying a CBAM. But there's also the fact that border tariffs are popular. And this is actually some more work that I did in my role as the co-director of the Carbon Pricing Initiative. This was pretty fun. I was approached, and my co-director Tom, we were approached by two researchers who wanted our advice on how to craft questions about carbon border measures, whether or not they're a tariff. And so we provided some feedback. They did some polling over the summer. We held an event in September, and we wrote a blog about it. If you go to this blog, you can read our conclusions, and you can also watch the original presentation if you like. But they asked 6 questions. And this, according to those researchers, was the first look at what Americans think about this emerging climate and trade nexus. And one of the most salient things that those researchers highlighted for me was the remarkable bipartisan agreement on this issue. They said they don't see this level of bipartisan agreement on any other issue. Now, what are some of the details? Well, here are the main conclusions I drew in that blog. Americans believe the goods we produce are comparatively low carbon relative to other countries. Americans support compliance with international trade agreements that we have signed. They are comfortable tightening the screws a bit on polluters at their border, and they're even willing to pay a bit to do so. Now, if you're like me, when you hear that last bullet point, that's a hand slap moment. Because if you've been focused on a carbon price for so long, you've seen poll after poll after poll saying that Americans don't like a carbon price. And this survey, the researchers did this, they find that in this survey where this is coming up. So it's really striking that you see huge agreement, bipartisan agreement with the statement, the US should place a tariff on goods manufactured in other countries that are produced with more greenhouse gas emissions than in the US, even if it raises the cost of buying those goods in the United States. It's very frustrating, but it's something to work with. And so that I think is a key takeaway. We also see large majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents agree strongly or somewhat. So that's the very lightest blue and the second lightest blue, that it is important for the United States to follow international trade agreements. And perhaps most significant of all, large majorities across all political affiliations believe that the US should prioritize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in trade. So you can see these numbers overall for Democrats and for Republicans agree and somewhat agree. This is very encouraging. And I do think that CCL should feel like you take some credit in this, because CCL has done so much work to make climate a bipartisan issue, not just on Capitol Hill, but in your districts. And so I think that this perhaps more than anything else gives me hope for that the next 4 years can still bring opportunities to move things forward. Some other considerations here. There are going to be problems with the WTO, the World Trade Organization, with any domestic use of revenue, including a dividend. However, if that's the direction things are going, then we push for it. And I do want to say something about the WTO. When CCL first adopted carbon fee and dividend 15 years ago, the WTO was sacrosanct. Politicians of both parties were unwilling to do anything that would not be okay with the WTO. That has changed. But they don't want to completely jump ship. So they want the big story, the trajectory, to be in line with WTO law, but they're not sweating the details. It's this really weird intellectual tension that is a big shift from when I first started paying attention to this. So that is something to bear in mind. American politicians are more willing to skate close to the sun, fly close to the sun with respect to the WTO than they were 15 years ago. Also reinforcing that you can do a lot with a big economy with a trade-focused climate policy. 25% of global emissions cross borders. And 15% of US consumption emissions are imported. So there's a lot of emissions that are tied up at the border or that cross borders. And also I want to emphasize again, a carbon tariff is distinct from other tariffs because with a carbon tariff, a country can stop paying it if they improve their behavior. So that is, I think it's going to be useful for CCL volunteers to bring up that point and make that distinction moving forward. We are already starting to see copycats of the EU CBAM. Other countries whose flags I've put here have started their own similar policies. Great Britain has even scheduled one to be implemented. Members of Congress have taken note and drafted related policy, which you'll be familiar with at this point: the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, the Clean Competition Act, and the Prove It Act. I do also want to, we're near the end here. I do want to highlight the revenue considerations. How much revenue could a CBAM bring? Not that much, as it turns out. The US trade to GDP ratio is 27%, meaning that 12% of our GDP comes from exports, 15% is attributed to imports, the rest is domestic. And so when you add those imports with the domestic, you're getting close to 90% of the United States economy is from the domestic market. So with a carbon border tariff, if you're just going after those imports, that's a comparatively small portion of the pie. An intensity-based tariff, which is what the Foreign Pollution Fee Act is, would exempt payment below a certain level. And what does intensity mean? It's for imports that have more carbon per good than the United States, they only pay above what the threshold is in the United States, because the United States isn't paying anything. So you're basically getting rid of any payments on carbon emissions that are equal to or probably just a little bit above what it is in the United States. So that's a lot more revenue that you're not collecting at the border. And just for reference, the EU CBAM is expected to raise 2.1 billion euros in 2030. 2.1 billion, not 2.1 trillion, 2.1 billion. And this is the figure where this estimate comes from the Center for Global Development. So I do think that the debt and the deficit and the EU CBAM are really separate considerations. The EU CBAM, a carbon border tariff, is not going to do much to reduce the deficit, is the main point here. So some conclusions, and then we'll get to some Q&A. There may still be an opportunity to pass a border carbon tariff in the 119th Congress, despite the results of the election. Because of Trump's and Republicans' predispositions, as well as the narrative that grew from the election regarding prices, a domestic carbon price is very likely out of the picture. CCL's goals remain reducing climate pollution, protecting households, and passing lasting policy. We will engage fully in any border carbon tariff debate with those goals front of mind. We will make it clear that we prefer a domestic carbon price, but it will not be a red line for us. And we were working on a long-term plan to bring it to the fore again. And with that, I think we have time for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And as you guys think of questions, make sure to put them in the Q&A box, and I will pass them along to Danny. And Rick Knight will also be answering any questions, typing them in if we don't have time to get to them. But I think we have about 15 to 20 minutes left for questions.
Let's roll.
Yeah, so I think one of the top voted ones from John Gage asked, why do we say that high prices were a dominant theme for the election? And this is a problem for carbon pricing when carbon fee and dividend returns all the money to households and thereby helps at least lower middle income families financially.
Well, John, you've been advocating for this for a long time. I think that you will agree with me that when you tell politicians that, they just don't believe it. And so there's a lag, and that I did not see we were able to really overcome, certainly not in the numbers needed when I was at CCL with the dividend. So it just wasn't enough. And in terms of was that the dominant theme, I mean, you can search the web, you can find it on basically any major news outlet. Some analysis that is going to say that high prices were a dominant theme for which votes went to Trump instead of Harris. And you can find them as that Financial Times article did, that this was in fact a global theme in elections around the world, really tying it back to the pandemic. So I feel pretty strong about that.
Okay, so Tom Wilson next notes that, President-elect Trump promises to be the tariff president. So therefore, shouldn't we now actively lobby Republicans to respond to the upcoming international border adjustments as a response to protect American manufacturing?
I mean, isn't that what could you read it again? It sounds like that's what I just said.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's kind of reiterating your point that to protect U.S. manufacturing, we should have a carbon border adjustment in place here since the EU is going to have one.
That will certainly be an argument that you can make when you're advocating for a carbon border tariff. Yes.
Okay, so Bruce has an interesting question. Since we have Republicans who are excited about the possibility of government efficiency, he's wondering if there's any analysis comparing the costs and efficiency of a carbon fee and dividend or carbon pricing with other kinds of general climate solutions to make that kind of case that it's an efficient way to solve the problem.
Well, certainly there's tons of studies that Dana has written up time and time again that a carbon price is more efficient than basically anything else. Not so much on a carbon tariff. Economists, I think, are going to be pretty sketched out by that. It was their advice that helped build the WTO, and so I think that they are very, very nervous, which is why I belabored that point with the study out of RFF, that study is for a CBAM with a domestic price, not a border tariff. I think that economists in general are very uncomfortable with tariffs in general and with a carbon border tariff. So I don't think you'll find much research on a tariff.
I think that's right, yeah. So Alex Amonette is wondering, should she or volunteers in general be asking state commerce departments what businesses in their states would would trade with the EU and Canada, given the potential for the implementation of EU CBAMs, because she in particular has had a hard time figuring out where to start in that kind of lobbying for CBAMs and wants to be prepared for it.
Absolutely. I think that knowing what businesses are in your district or in your state and how they would fare under the EU CBAM, I think that's very valuable. In the October 17th presentation, I shared a tool, I believe it was the World Bank, that enabled you to look up all the goods that are subject to the EU CBAM and how they would fare from country to country. And so for a lot of the goods, as I said, the United States businesses are actually going to do better. So that's going to be a cross current if you're advocating to put a carbon border tariff. The United States goods are going to gain market share in the EU CBAM. It's just that we won't get to keep the money. Once that's up, we're going to be giving Europeans the tax revenue that we could have kept if we had a domestic price. That's the rub for politicians.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned international trade agreements, and there is just a question here if you could explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, international trade agreements are negotiated within the context of the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade, which is a foundational document for the World Trade Organization. And so USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which was negotiated by President Trump himself, that is a different trade agreement, but it is under the WTO framework. And I think that this is going to be something that's one example of many trade agreements of which the United States is party, and it's going to be a big theme. It's pretty clear that for the United States to unilaterally slap a 25% tariff on Mexico or Canada would be a violation of the US-Mexico trade agreement, as President Trump has suggested. So there's a dispute resolution mechanism within that, and so it's very different to have such a president who's so interested in tariffs and in seemingly tearing up the text of trade agreements that he himself negotiated. So there's a lot of uncertainty. I'll say that.
There certainly is. We've had a lot of discussions, especially on the forums in the Nerd Corner, about the influence that Elon Musk might have, given that he has expressed favorable opinions of a carbon price. So do you want to provide your thoughts on the influence of Elon Musk potentially on carbon pricing in the incoming administration?
I don't think it changes what I've said, that I really don't think there's going to be a domestic carbon price possible this Congress. With unified Republican control, even if Democrats vote for it, even if they were to provide the majority of the votes, Republicans are going to get blamed. And I think that is a bigger problem for Republican politicians than it is for Democrats. And so, especially, like I said, it's a paradox for Trump to push tariffs, which are going to raise prices as well. But that's also part of why he won the election, pushing hard on tariffs. And so he's somehow made that paradox work for him. But it is a paradox, and I don't think it works for a domestic carbon price. He definitely did not campaign on that. If anything, he campaigned on hostility to that. And so I really don't. So it's really, really difficult to see how a domestic carbon price would pass in this political constellation.
That's fair. Question from Lisa Oliver. I guess referring to potential research and data on how effective carbon pricing has been in countries that have implemented it to reduce their emissions. Do you have any
Dana,
references?
do you want to take that one, Dana?
We have written about that quite a bit on the Nerd Corner, and I've written about it on Yale Climate Connections, and Jonathan Marshall has put together a big resource that documents some of that as well, various economic literature on carbon pricing.
You want it, we got it.
Yeah, okay, let's see. We got a question from Linda Kingery. are there industries or sectors that have expressed favorability for a CBAM or any that have expressed opposition to a CBAM?
That is a great question. One that jumps top of mind is shipping, actually, which has gone beyond CBAM and has expressed favorability for a global carbon tax on shipping, and they're going to do it. And so this is a step beyond, and so that's very interesting that shipping, which is pretty energy intensive endeavor, has said we're gonna put a carbon tax on ourselves. So that's one thing. Certainly, steel and aluminum have been at the center of this debate. It's another very carbon intensive process, and there was I think it's the 232 Section 232 tariffs that came to the fore in the first Trump presidency, and there's been a lot of discussion and negotiation between the United States and the EU, and using a construction for those tariffs that enables them to put pressure on countries that are not so clean. So I don't have a specific answer to that question. I don't think that that I'm seeing that with the EU CBAM. I know that you are seeing some opposition from some countries, particularly developing countries, who in the COP process that's been coming up. So that's interesting to watch. But in terms of industries for or against the EU CBAM, just the industry independent of a country, I haven't tracked that.
Okay, thanks. We have a sort of technical terminology question from Eric. How is a CBAM different from a carbon tariff?
Adjustment. The carbon border adjustment suggests that there is already something pre-existing, like a domestic carbon price. A carbon border tariff provides no such suggestion. So the presence of the word adjustment in carbon border adjustment mechanism, that's the distinction. CBAM is for a place where there is a domestic carbon price. Carbon border tariff is for a place where there's no domestic carbon price.
That makes sense. We got a few questions about the difference between US industry emissions intensities and Europe's industry emissions intensities, which Europe's appear to be a bit lower than ours.
Correct.
So the questions are basically, will we be in a deficit if there's kind of a CBAM in the EU and a CBAM in the US in terms of our exports to Europe or imports from Europe?
European manufactured goods would have a very slight advantage over American goods, but both would have a much larger advantage relative to goods from some other countries. And so the difference between the EU and the United States is much smaller than the difference between the EU and the United States and some of these other countries. And so both would be expected to gain market share if either the United States or the EU placed a CBAM. And of course, the EU already has a CBAM in place.
Yeah, and one of our previous questions that I haven't gotten to yet was, when will the EU CBAM go into effect, or has it already gone into effect?
It's already gone into effect. It started in October of last year, and they're going to with reporting, and it's going to start. They're going to start collecting revenues in January of 2026. So right in the middle of this coming Congress, and so that's a date that might really amp up the saliency of the EU CBAM for American politicians when American companies actually have to start paying to subsidize European taxpayers.
Okay. And Nancy's asking about sort of tariffs in general, but applying to carbon tariffs. Don't tariffs levied by one country just lead to tariffs being levied in retaliation by other countries?
I mean, yes. And so this is again the uncertainty. I mean, this is decades of work by a lot of countries. The United States certainly huge leader in that process to get international trade to where it is now. And it's not really clear how that's going to unfold as you start unpicking the threads of that tapestry. But threads are being unpicked and at an increasing pace. And so some things I think are predictable. It's not my expertise, but I think that we learned enough from the 20s and 30s and the eras before about how countries respond to predict some things, but other things in the changes that have happened to global economies over the past 80 years are much more difficult to predict.
Okay, and Ira's asking, and noting that you've made a persuasive case that border adjustments have little effect on revenue, does that mean that they'll also have a small effect on emissions in the US or worldwide?
We are going to see. I don't think so. And the reason why I have such an uncertain response is because, as I've said, economists don't like to study this. There aren't examples, right? So it would be theoretical, number one. And number two, it's kind of heresy, economic heresy, to say let's increase tariffs. And so it's not what economists are comfortable with. And so when they model it, to the extent that they model it in the context of a domestic carbon price. So there aren't studies directly related to this. However, I do think that it would encourage good behavior based on anecdotes and analogy. And that's not what you want to really go forward, but this is politics and it's messy and it's ugly and you gotta kind of cast yourself into the mix if you're gonna be an advocate where you don't always have the most robust research background. And so the analogies, I mean, you can look at the United States debate in 2009, where we failed to pass Waxman-Markey very soon after China adopted cap and trade. And so that was something that wasn't even adopted, and yet it would appear that another country adopted it. And then, as I said, that study from RFF, you are looking at the EU CBAM and how that is encouraging other countries, seemingly. It's correlation, I don't think they proved causation, but correlation with more carbon prices. And as has already been covered, well documented in the Nerd Corner, carbon prices are extremely efficient at encouraging people to reduce emissions.
Yeah, I think the question there is once we get a bunch of different countries and big markets putting this price on extra carbon intensities, is that going to be effective at convincing industries in other countries to reduce their emissions so they don't have to pay for that extra carbon price? And we would hope that would be the case, but yeah, we don't yet have the experimental evidence to find out.
Well, this is where markets come into play. I mean, it's adapt or go out of business. You either reduce your emissions or you go out of business. That's part of why a carbon price has been so appealing, is because it harnesses market forces. And so what it's doing is it's internalizing the externality of all those carbon emissions. And so that people actually see it in the price they pay. And they're going to favor companies that can deliver lower prices, and the higher the price, the more that's going to reflect they're actually producing fewer emissions for that product. So that, I mean, that would be the fundamental logic for why we would say, yes, companies will change or they'll die.
Yeah, and also the more countries, and especially countries with big markets that apply this CBAM or carbon tariff, the more of a signal there is, and the more uh, motivation there is for companies to do that.
Right. And again, the United States is alone on this. We are the only developed economy without a carbon price. And there are a lot of developing economies with the IMF classifies as developing economies who also have a carbon price. So we're really out on a limb here.
Yeah. So I think we've got time for maybe one more, and let's go to Don Kraus. And he's asking, are we no longer supporting carbon fee and dividend, or if not now, will we come back to it? Under what conditions? What are your thoughts on that previous iteration of carbon pricing that we were advocating
Carbon
for?
fee and dividend was a solution to a particular moment in time. And that moment in time was right after Waxman-Markey. And it was a great policy. It was a great solve for that. When I was working with Mark and Marshall to develop that and build that out in 2009, it was very much of the moment. And times have really changed. As I mentioned, both the parties don't care about the WTO as much. They don't seem to care as deficits as much. Climate is still is still really bad. And you have most of the rest of the world who has a carbon price, and you finally have a bloc of countries that is demanding accountability at their borders. It's necessary to adapt to the circumstances. And so, as I said in the presentation, the principles that inspired that policy design of taking a big chunk out of emissions, making sure low-income households are taken care of, and making sure that it's robust, lasting policy design, those principles that led to the design elements of carbon fee and dividend, those are still our principles. And those will inform any policy we advocate for moving forward. But we do have to adapt over the past 15 years, and we need to account for the current political reality, which is very, very different than the political reality of 2009.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.